And I don't know, I can't point at people because you're all in different places on different screens. So who wants to go first? Juliet, why don't you go first?
Oh, okay. So, hello, I'm an architect and urban designer. I'm based in the Southwest, and the focus of my work is on policy and strategy, but I also work with communities on community-led projects, and those recently have been focused loosely on infrastructure or soft infrastructure. So I'm currently leading engagement for the Architecture Centre Bristol for the West of England Placemaking Charter and developing a community design code for an interwar garden suburb in South Bristol. And I'm a design review panel chair for Design Southwest and Design West. And some of my approach is influenced by my time as a founding member of Muff Architecture Art, who are a public space collaborative practice.
Oh, fantastic. Phil, do you want to go next?
Right, yeah, thanks Gary. So yeah, my name is Phil Jones. I originally trained as a civil engineer, went into highways and traffic engineering, and then during the course of my career kind of I became very interested in urban design and placemaking and how streets can either add to or detract from the sense of place. And I guess that's been where I focused the latter part of my career. I was involved in the original drafting of Manual for Streets and Manual for Streets 2 and various other documents. And like Juliet, I sit on design review panels, which I find very interesting, and just commenting as to how transport and streets can add to the quality of developments. And founded a practice, Phil Jones Associates, now PJA. We're about 80 strong now, and we do transport engineering and placemaking. Thanks.
Fantastic. Tim.
Thanks, Gary. Morning, everyone. Thanks for joining. I'm Tim Stoner. I'm an architect and an urban planner. And my day job is at Space Syntax, a company that uses technology to describe and then predict how people flow in public space and what that then means for the design of the buildings that form the public space and everything else that goes in it. And I therefore have a big interest in mobility, especially walking and cycling. I'm the deputy chair of the Design Council and a chair of design review from time to time, and a design review panel member, and something that I think is so valuable in the process that we might talk more about later on in the conversation. I'm also a director of the Academy of Urbanism, which is a great membership organization for people who are passionate to learn from each other about the built environment. Recommend everyone takes a look at the Academy. And I'm looking forward to today's conversation.
Oh, fantastic. Fantastic. I should introduce myself. Thank you, panel. I'm Garry Hall. I'm chairing this today, as much as you can chair anything like this. I'm an urban designer by background with a kind of stint in planning policy, and I've worked variously with pretty much everyone on the panel today around movement projects. I find this a particularly fascinating topic I'm really excited about today. Before we get into the discussion, I'm just going to run through, just for the benefit of everyone listening in, how today's going to work, how the rest of the hour is going to work, and what we're expecting from you. What we don't want is everyone sat there just listening. We're trying to get conversations going. You'll notice on your screen that you've got a chat window. We encourage you to use that. There's the option to ask questions, and we found in the past it's quite difficult to keep up with the questions as the conversation's flowing, but we'll do our best to have some time at the end of the day to answer those questions. We'll also be running a series of polls, and we want to get your view. This is as much about learning from each other and speaking to each other as it is about listening to us talk about this topic. I'm just going to try and share this, one sec. So this is where we are, just a little bit of background. Can everyone see the panel? You can see my presentation here, that's all. Yep. Right, perfect. This is a fourth webinar in our series. Originally, we'd only planned to do 3, and we've had some good feedback and positive kind of demand for stuff, so we're actually running now to 5. Let me just click on. It's a collaborative project. We've got Creating Excellence in Design Midlands, who have been given some funding. Originally, when pre-COVID, this would have been a series of training events, and something probably that everyone's a lot more familiar with. going to a room, networking, training, that kind of thing. We're all kind of scrabbling to figure out this kind of new world that we're in. We're actually finding this works very well, these remote sessions. And it's opened up opportunities to get people from different geographical locations. I know we've got some people from overseas joining us today who just wouldn't have been able to participate in stuff like this. So I'm actually quite excited about the things that we've been forced to learn. And we'll talk a bit more in the session about COVID and how that kind of thinking might change our patterns of working. So we're here, on our webinar 4. I'm going to just assume that everyone's read the National Design Guide, but for those of you who may need a little bit of a brush up on it, the reason we're here is because this document was launched back in October of last year, MHCLG document, and it's an interesting document in that it moves away from the kind of how-to guides that we're used to, and it moves more into describing the outcomes that are desirable. So it doesn't necessarily tell you what to do, but it tells you what you will be looking at, or what the attributes of a successful place are. It's the structure of it is it's got 3 overarching themes: climate, character, and community. And those of you familiar working with previous design guides will find that they're very siloed, and they tend to kind of imply that there are different disciplines and different things, and the amount of overlap is minimal. This has been written to try and make people realize that all of these are interwoven and intertwined, and you can't do one without impacting on another. So within the three overarching themes, you have 10 characteristics, and the one we're talking about today is movement. So characteristics is an interesting term. I think it describes the kind of attributes or the performance criteria rather than this is how you do it. So the movement section asks for things to be accessible and easy to move around in. I'll just read this. I promise you is the only text I'm really going to read. The National Design Guide describes a well-designed place as having a movement network that defines a clear pattern of streets that is safe and accessible, functions efficiently, limits the impact of car use, promotes activity and social interaction. I think there's quite a few agendas creeping into the National Design Guide that were absent in previous planning and design thinking from, say, 20 years ago. And then it talks about incorporating green infrastructure and street trees. And I think that's going to be an interesting topic we can talk about. I've got a couple of slides that kind of show, Tim, I put this one in for you. I love this image. I love these images of kind of cities from space and just kind of showing the kind of veins of the place at night. So there are several layers to this. In the design guide, it talks about the quality of the place, but it also talks about patterns, street integration, but place integration and destinations and how people might move around. Generally, I think my personal view is that we are designing some quite attractive streets in certain places, but there are challenges to this that we'll cover. A big emphasis now on modal shift and designing streets as places. And Phil and Juliet, I know you'll talk about this in detail. And what does the future hold? What are we going to be doing in terms of facilitating movement in the future, with a recognition that not only can we not carry on doing what we've been doing, but it's probably not desirable anyway. People are quite comfortable to, as I think this whole recent pandemic has shown, people are quite comfortable to move away. And I wonder how much of the new way of moving is going to be sticky and is going to hang around even once we can get back in our cars. I've just thrown some images together there. I want to talk about the future of streets and spaces, because in terms of what we build is actually a minimal amount. What it's going to be curating and managing what already exists that's going to be a big challenge. And I know that a lot of people have started to think about how we might repurpose existing public space as the demands of it change. So I think if we've got time, we can talk about that later. Right, you'll be pleased to know that's all you have to hear from me. I wanted to probably start with probably a discussion about what the current issues are around movement. I think, and what is it that the National Design Guide is trying to address? Oh no, we've got our audio issues creeping back in. Who wants to start on that? Oh, Phil, you're muted. Sorry.
I'd be happy to take a start. I think for me, and it's one of the key messages in the NDG is looking beyond the site boundary. I think that in the context of new development, which is obviously one of the principal functions of the design guide, it's written for the planning system and therefore for new development. Developers, planning permissions have a red line. Developers are essentially delivering a scheme within that red line. And understandably, the focus of design teams is on the content of what they're developing and the market for it and the viability of it and so on and so forth. And there's a limit to some extent as to what developers can do beyond the limit of their ownership. But in order to create places that are well connected and easy to move around and not beyond the confines of what might be a relatively small piece of urban area, it is really important that we look beyond the site. And that is something that when I come to design reviews, often a problem that I find is that that's not given the attention that it deserves, and it is a challenge as to how we can address that. I don't know whether my other panel members can offer a view on that, but I think it is that what I've often called kind of redlinism is a bit of a disease that a pandemic that afflicts the development process.
Yeah, I mean, I could say one or two things to maybe build on what Phil's just said, because I think it's absolutely right that context matters. It's foundational. The location of a site will condition very much about what then happens on that site, regardless of what else you do. And, you know, I think it goes without saying that everyone wants space to be well used. Good space is well used space. But it's a fact, I think, that we've seen that most space use between buildings is movement. And I think that's just worth anchoring and remembering. And of movement, most movement is through movement. So if you look at a street in any town, especially in traditional towns, most of the people walking down that street, driving down, cycling down, haven't originated on their journey there, and they're not destined there, they're passing through. And that's why this point about context matters, because the life of your street will be conditioned by the amount of movement that passes through it. That, of course, brings problems which you can design out. The kind of problems of speeding, rat running, traffic, they can be designed out. But the irrigation of people passing along your street is generally a good thing, and it keeps the street safe. It adds to the street life. It means that as you stand there on your doorstep, you get to see not just your neighbors, but strangers. And that component can be a very positive social component of any well-used place.
Just to add to that, I think that it's really good that the National Design Guide talks about working outside the red line boundary, because often it's really important to understand where a site is conceptually in relation to the centre of a place, or where it is in relation to its adjacent neighbourhood. And that thing about working inside the red line boundary means often we see at design review projects that just sort of exist hermetically inside that red line. So that idea of thinking about how do I get to school, or how do I get into town, how do I get to the next place on foot or by cycle, and actually thinking that through, or going to the site and walking those routes and going to discover what it's like to be downtown in that place. Those are really important things. And I think another thing maybe to add to that is that it's been really good to see last week Building for a Healthy Life, the new Building for Life published, because that also starts to talk about design process and the sort of fact of needing to give time at the beginning of a project to properly understand a context, or properly research and understand a place, because that talks, for example, about the need for a clear and logical concept diagram which might link to your site analysis outside the red line boundary. So
yeah, no, I think that's all right. And do you think one of the things that I come across quite often when talking to developers is they actually, and designers in particular, they don't necessarily understand, I don't think, the benefits that movement can give you. Instead, they focus on the negatives. Does anyone want to talk briefly about that kind of antagonism between what people think they want, which is to live somewhere quiet and tucked away and where they don't have to deal with kind of traffic and so on and so forth, and then all the other kind of things they do want, which is the ability to get places easily and to have kind of vibrancy just around the corner so that they can dip in and out when they want to. That to me doesn't seem like a well articulated conversation that we're having at the moment, especially in this country.
Well, I think it's because we've had 50, 60 years of building car-dependent, isolated housing estates. And so we see movement from the perspective of the car, and that it's a bad thing when it's anywhere near you, but it's a good thing if you're in it. You know, that's been the kind of mindset. We have to see speed as one of the key issues in this conversation. I think that slow speed movement is generally a very good thing, and vastly different to faster movement. And so, you know, one of the discussions around movement I would suggest is always about slowing things down and taking the speeds down, whether it's a car or whether it's a cycle or whether it's an e-scooter. This discussion around movement has to be a discussion around speed.
That's been an interesting thing during the sort of COVID lockdown, because of being able to drive or not using cars for a period of time and then getting back into a car and then finding oneself driving very gingerly or driving very differently around places and starting to look as you drove. And so it'd be interesting. Obviously, COVID's changed everyone's behaviour because it's enabled us to understand how we could enjoy walking or cycling or being outdoors, but maybe it might change how we feel about driving, whether how, you know. And so I think some of Phil's projects about slowing all of the traffic, all of the vehicles down within a settlement boundary, that seems to be an interesting way forward, that all of the traffic always gets civilized and slowed as it comes into a settlement boundary, whether that be a village or a town or a city neighborhood. So that you have to drive carefully if you're in a settlement. Because I think the other thing that's slightly implied in the National Design Guide is the idea of inclusion and equity, and to be always displacing pollution onto inner urban neighbourhoods is an unfairness that we've lived with for quite a long time now, but maybe it's not acceptable going forward, especially now we understand the impact on air quality, poor air quality on health for the people who live with poor air quality, which can be in a rural town, not just in an urban neighbourhood, but yeah. So
yeah, I think sorry, I would say I think it's kind of interesting this point about a balance between modes. I think the National Design Guide talks about good places offer a choice of ways to travel, but is it appropriate to have a level playing field, or do we want to favour, through the design, through the network, through the connectivity, those modes of transport that are more benign and healthier? And I think that's probably for me where the debate is at now. So if we went back to Design Bulletin 32 and the kind of loops and lollipops and cul-de-sac led mentality, that controlled traffic and speed of traffic, but it also it controlled connectivity for walking and cycling as well. So yes, we got slow speeds and we got low volumes of traffic, but we got car dependency. Money for Streets encourage greater connectivity and a more even spread of traffic, a dispersion of traffic, and slower speeds. But what we found with places like Waltham Forest that have gone down the low traffic neighbourhood route within traditional grid patterns, by closing some streets to car traffic and leaving them open to walking, cycling, and public transport, we've given a benefit to those modes of transport and a disbenefit to driving for short trips. And I think for me that's kind of where we might go with the next iteration of this. So we do have connected networks, we do have grids, but we might choose, just through some judicious closing of points to car traffic, to favour other modes. But getting the balance right is really difficult. You know, it's quite sensitive. one person's rat run is another person's permeability. So getting that balance right is not always easy, and there are no black and whites here. But I think speed is important, but sometimes volume of traffic as well. So even if we have a relatively slow car use but heavy numbers, that can itself erode the quality of public life and neighbourliness, I think. So I think for me, that's kind of where the debate is at the moment.
Just we've got our first poll, so attendees, I want you to all join in. How has your use of public space changed during the lockdown? Have you done more of the following? And then we've got a list of walking, cycling, running, and so on and so forth. One of the things I wanted to talk about is, this is something that you will be closer to than I am in terms of the data. Are people using this as an opportunity to study how people are adapting? And this seems to me to be a great opportunity to look at a way we might change the way we use our street patterns, our existing street patterns particularly. Is that work ongoing? Have you heard of anyone who's taking a good look at how people are adapting to COVID? You get the feeling that a lot of people took advantage. You remember when we were only allowed kind of 1 hour a day of exercise, and suddenly everybody was a really keen walker and cyclist. How much of that do you think is going to stay post-lockdown? How much of this is habit forming?
I think that there will be an awful lot of academic research going on. Just my colleagues at University College London, I know, are looking into this, but that will take some time to roll through. In the meantime, there is massive experimentation going on right now. And so there's another kind of research, which is almost a day-to-day citizen-based research, local authority-based research, putting up the cones, putting up the barriers, seeing if they work or not, move them if they don't. And I think that will also deserve systematic review in the long run. That's kind of, I think, the first half of what you said. The second is the good stuff should stick, because it'll be good in the sense that people will see the benefits of it. And so if town centres are pedestrianised, and if the shops see a benefit to trade, it's going to be very difficult to remove that pedestrianisation from an economic perspective. If, on the other hand, there's barriers down the street, but not helping maybe give wider footways, but not helping people cross the road, then I think people will say that's not working for us because we can only shop one side of the high street. Well, it doesn't take much to just remove the odd barrier if you've got an experimental mindset. And so I think the degree to which these changes will stick will be based a lot around the agility, the nimbleness, the mindfulness of those in authority to accept that maybe the first thing they did might not be right.
Yeah, it does seem to me that we as a nation, we tend not to be willing to experiment in the ways that you see on the continent, where people will just put in temporary schemes, monitor them, assess the data, and make a kind of empirical judgment or a informed choice.
Yeah, no, I was going to say, we also know that a huge proportion of our car journeys are really quite short and therefore walkable and cyclable, but they are suppressed by conditions. And what we saw when car traffic was suppressed by the lockdown, suddenly that blossomed. It was kind of flowers in the desert time, and so I think what it's taught us is, well, a couple of things. Firstly, we can't deny that there is demand out there for more walking and cycling. Sometimes decision makers have said, well, why would we invest in cycle facilities? No one around here cycles, which is kind of the other end of the telescope, and I think we can't deny that's the case now. The other thing for me is that it's shown is how quickly human behaviour can change. I think the way we plan, the default is just to extrapolate past behaviour. We kind of learn from that, and that's how an awful lot of transport assessments are done. And I think we have to rethink that those methodologies. We rely a lot on predict and provide. So we look at past trends, we predict the travel demands of a new development, and we provide the infrastructure that we think is needed to cope with that. on the assumption that the vast majority of people will continue to drive relatively short trips. Well, maybe we need to move away from that to what people are calling decide and provide. You know, what kind of future movement strategy do we want for an area, and what infrastructure and facilities and encouragement and social infrastructure is needed to support that. So, and I think that the pandemic has taught us that that is perhaps more possible than many people might have imagined.
I think it's interesting. The pandemic has made visible the possibilities, hasn't it, very quickly, and all the we'd perhaps been too afraid to experiment, but lots of experiments have happened, and that thing of making the invisible more visible. So walking and cycling and playing tend to be less visible or less measured and understood. And on the project in Bristol, I'm working with Sarah Jones Morris, a landscape architect, and we've used 3 different ways of understanding the site. One is we've used the space syntax open source model. Thank you, Tim. And then we've also started using Strava and Street Map, which the government were using during lockdown, to actually look at where people are walking and cycling and have a map of how people are behaving. And then the third thing that we're proposing to use is to use the kind of methodologies that Playing Out have used in Bristol, which is using citizen-led appropriation of spaces. And we're thinking about developing toolkits to take up parking space, which has been done widely internationally, but that's sort of possibly another kind of tool for change, which is those sort of citizen-led initiatives like Playing Out, and people have been making proposals for this summer to award highways engineers prizes for shutting down streets and making them playable over this summer holiday. So that idea of engaging people in processes of change as well is seems like a third strand that's important.
I think that's right. I think that's a really good point, that the fact that we are now seeing the importance of these hidden invisible modes is also requiring the professional advice community, the governance and decision-making community to think differently about how they then procure this. And the fact that so much of the demand is directly coming from the community means that those in authority have to think differently about top-down. They have to think about bottom-up processes far more than they may have done before. So how you engage with the community, how you consult with the community on ideas, how you generate ideas with the community, I think are almost as exciting as the product. You know, the process is as exciting as the product.
Do you
Oh, sorry, I was going to say that's difficult in new development, of course, but you know, in the past when we were working on the home zone movement, which has kind of fallen out of favour, but I think echoes a lot of these ideas, suggested that, well, maybe developers could leave some areas of developments kind of fallow. You know, that when residents move in, that there's a pot of money there that they can actually make changes later. I was just going to mention, again, one of the pieces of work I've been doing recently for the Welsh Government, and the report will be out next week, is bring in a national default 20 mile an hour for any roads with street lighting. So moving away from the 30 miles an hour that we have in the UK at the moment, that would be, unless the signs tell you otherwise, will be 20 miles per hour in Wales. And there should be a vote in the Welsh Parliament next week to hopefully endorse that. But as part of the recommendations for that would be to set up a fund for local residents to have access to support and money to make low-cost changes to their streets. Planters, painting, kind of all kinds of low-cost pop-up measures that would not only change drivers and driver behaviour, but actually by involving local people, it would hopefully engender a sense of, well, as a community, we agree this is what our streets are for, and we buy into that, and so to normalise the behaviour that driving more slowly and being out on the street and meeting one another is something to be supported. So, you know, hopefully that will be something that maybe is coming at least in part of the UK.
I think that's really interesting, because I think one of the conversations that I often find myself having about this kind of thing is the antagonism between the kind of place we want to make and the design speed that somebody will sign off. And getting 20 mile an hour streets has been quite difficult in a lot of places. due to discussions with highways departments, the fact that the community could go in and effectively traffic calm their streets to make them kind of behaviour led rather than as they are now, I think is, do you think that could something that could roll across the border?
Yes, I think so, very much so. I think that you know, one of the things we also know is that always there's a view that, well, it's different here, isn't it? You know, attitudes are different here, but the reality is people are people. There's no reason why that can't spread. I just noticed on the chat that Peter Sandover said, why have home zones fallen out of favour? And I think it's purely the cost. You know, that when we were working on them in the early 2000s, there was some very heavy expenditure on a relatively small number of streets. I think perhaps what we need to do is take the essence of that community-led change, but do it in a lower cost way that can be rolled out much more widely. Yeah.
I wanted just to give a mention today to research done by Diana Bornat on Into Play, which she did for the Homes and Communities Agency 5 years ago now. And she was building on research that Mike Biddulph had done into home zones. And he'd found that children didn't stay in their home zones, that they went from one home zone to another place, especially teenagers wanted to roam around. And that's something that Diana Bornat's been advocating for as well, which is the idea of independent play for children. And when you start to introduce that as a test for new development and for retrofit, then that does give you quite a lot of challenges. You know, just the idea of how to achieve independent mobility for a 10-year-old. And that could be a kind of design test of place going forward in the future. And I just wanted to highlight that research, because the research that Diana Bornat did for the Homes and Communities Agency Into Play was really interesting in that it showed that when places are playable, they become more sociable for adults as well. Adults spend more time in the street. So that idea of it being a kind of test for the quality of place it seems quite powerful. And Phil, you're talking about working in Wales, but I know her research has influenced policy in Wales, but it's also influenced policy in London. But it'd be good to see that more of a national ambition. And the design guide does touch on it a bit, because it mentions doorstep play, for example, when it's talking about public space. But yeah, I just wanted to mention that as a kind of resource for people.
I think it was really noticeable that when lockdown happened and people weren't driving as much, the most visible manifestation of change was chalk on the ground of kids playing and painting stones and graffiti, and you know the window decorations of relating to health and care work, and I think that really speaks to the point that play is fundamental. And on the subject of making all of this stick and making this change come about, I can only emphasize having a community voice as being a really powerful tool. Yes, we can have models, and that's my day job, and analytics and research and data, but there's also nothing like community demand. And I think we're in an interesting moment in the UK, where we've got in the Department for Transport, at a senior Secretary of State level, a demand for radical change, so at the most high level, and then at the grassroots level, we've got the manifestation of what that change delivers. And you've got both ends of the scale covered. We've managed to get a 20-mile-an-hour limit agreed for the town that I live in. And that's come about. Phil, could I suggest, could you try muting and just see whether the crackling stops? I'm doing a little experiment here. Could you just mute a sec and just to see if the crackling stops? There's something about the feedback on it's not that we don't want to hear you. But what's happened here in Faversham, we've got a 20-mile-an-hour limit agreed for a whole town. It'll be the most significant outside of a big city, 20,000 population town, going to 20 miles an hour. That's come about because we just didn't give up. We just kept going back every time they said no. If you look on my blog or on my Twitter feed, I list 10 the 10 points of community engagement, 10 top tips for community engagement. And pretty much most of them are about just not giving up. And in the end, Kent County Council rewrote its policy to say that it would justify expenditure on 20-mile-an-hour limits, not on the basis of statistics of death and serious injury, but instead on community demand. And that's a huge milestone, I think, in the thinking at that senior decision-making level. We don't need people to die and be knocked over. What we need is the community to demand this.
We've only got really about 10 minutes left before we need to make sure we leave enough time to answer the questions that people have been. Thank you for those that have been coming through. The bits that I want to tick off, I want to talk briefly, if we can, about how the quality of the streets and spaces that we design affects their attractiveness and the willingness of people to use them. How much of an influencing factor is the actual design quality versus its functionality and where a street system can take you? I'm
sorry. I would say yes. Materials, the materiality, and getting planting, all of that can create a lovely local environment. But I think for me, the connectivity and the structure of a place is fundamental, because materials change over time. Even buildings change over time. The street patterns, once they're laid down, are very, very hard to change. They're in perpetuity, really. So, those post-war loops and lollipops and DB32 disconnected places are with us forever. They're going to be very, very hard to change. So I think getting that right is fundamentally important. I mean, what we found I just saw Wilf was asked on the chat about Waltham Forest, and so that grid pattern, Victorian grid pattern, is very resilient and changeable and adaptable over time. At the moment we have necessarily to put in filters to reduce car traffic, but in 50 years' time we may not have private cars driven by humans, and we may not need that. We may not need those bollards and barriers, and they can be taken out, and replaced with something else. So, but whereas the rigidity of that cul-de-sac system is there forever. Having said all of that, clearly, once you get down to the neighbourhood level and the street level, then having good materials and good planting and rain gardens and all of that is very important too. And we're unfortunately constrained very often because of the willingness of local authorities to adopt materials that aren't very, very cheap to maintain. And that is a very difficult nut to crack, I think.
It's also interesting how built form adds to the street network. I agree with what Phil says about the streets here for thousands of years and the buildings maybe for hundreds of years, but also it's really important how the built form frames the streets and the quality of spaces that the buildings generate. So good example for me would be somewhere like Accordia, which is quite an old project now, but just the very clever way it frames some very tight muse streets that sort of compress movement or opens up into sort of wider streets. That sort of idea of sort of how streets compress and expand, and how you helps you to find your way around. And then also the other thing added to that is just the idea about land use and eyes on the street, and how sort of careful positioning of windows and land use makes streets usable at different times of the day. And so there is this sort of layering on then of built form to a good street pattern that's really important.
Right, I'm going to echo everything that's just been said and agree with it. I think build grids. There was a great documentary I watched last night on the M25. Who thought there could be a great documentary on the M25? But it was looking at the natural ecosystems around the M25, and there's a piece in it about the grid structure of mushrooms and fungi, and the fact that their root networks are grids, so that if one bit gets taken down, like a bird eats into it or an insect eats it, the traffic flows alternatively around it. It made me realize nature and cities are actually very, very similar. And the benefit of a grid is one part of it goes down, the traffic can divert around it. You can pedestrianize it. This decade, you can unpedestrianize it the next decade, but that's all nothing unless you've got somewhere to go to. And that's why the detail then matters. That's why the quality then matters. You need both destinations and then good destinations.
From experience, I've found that design teams are far more comfortable talking about the detail of how their particular street network is going to be a quality place, rather than talking about the quality of the structure that they're putting in. And it's like with buildings, very quickly you end up talking about the materials and the kind of micro details, and you skip a very important bit in the middle. But it's interesting that maybe we need to pay more attention. Well, it sounds like we definitely need to transfer our attention to these bigger questions. I'm just conscious of time. Did you want to say something, Phil? Sorry.
I was only just going to say that. Sorry, is that coming through? No, I was only going to say one of the problems that we have is that highway authorities are cash strapped, and they understandably focus on what are their key statutory functions of highway authorities, which is keeping traffic moving. So while individual highway officers may have a lot of sympathy with the idea of say reducing rainfall runoff or heat island effect or whatever, that's not what the highway authority is kind of there to do. So I think we have a structural problem in the way our streets are managed in the UK that at some point will need to be addressed.
So highways engineers need to have a responsibility to deliver ecosystem services. And then maybe the projects that we've seen in Sheffield West, where highways are becoming landscape corridors, could be more of a national thing. Because I think the other thing about the grid is its macro scale as well, and how with climate change, we need big landscape grids for creatures to be able to move north and south as climate changes. And that's also the other sort of challenge, isn't it? The biodiversity emergency. So that idea of functional movement networks for us, but functional movement networks for nature is also really important on another scale.
And actually that idea that connectivity for nature is something that is pulled out in the new building for healthy life, which I think is really good. And yeah, I think it's not enough though to kind of talk about highway engineers, because highway engineers work for highway authorities. So I think it's more fundamental, it's more institutional than that. We need to say what are our streets for, and therefore what do we want our public bodies to do and to prioritise when they're designing and maintaining those streets.
Maybe it's a job for Sadie Morgan and the National Infrastructure Commission, because if we're going to have infrastructure first, perhaps we should have more of a dialogue about what infrastructure first actually is, and it should be this layering of different infrastructures, like the one of ecology as well. Or
can I raise a concern about this, which is not that I don't agree, I fundamentally agree. It's that so often in urban design proposals, the landscape corridor is this super wide green belt that separates housing communities either side of it and gets us probably a more fragmented, more dispersed and more car dependent form of mobility than it would do if it were subtler and narrower. I mean, if you can see behind me, there's a lot of green. That's actually a landscape corridor. It's a stream, and it's maybe 20 meters wide at its widest, but it's a footpath and it's a chalk stream. It's one of the most endangered habitats on the planet. There's only 200 of them on the planet, but it's also where we walk. It's where we walk the dog, and it's the heart of the local neighborhood. I don't think one compromises the other at all. In fact, they enhance the other. And putting a big green splodge across an urban design proposal doesn't necessarily make it more ecological. Sometimes you need a thinner green line to actually deliver the difference.
Yeah, I mean, it's the idea of multifunctionality and making sure that you can get efficient use of these corridors and spaces is something that seems to be a slow lesson, but people are learning it. But again, is this back to siloed thinking? Is where you get your ecology consultant to come along and design your green grid, but they don't talk to your drainage consultant and so on and so forth. Everyone comes up with their own system, and they don't share the same spaces. Is that the issue, or is it more fundamental than that?
Well, I think ultimately it's the kind of fragmentation. It's almost like the balkanization of institutions, really. And we kind of see the same thing, say, in the railway industry. You know, I'm not, sort of not getting off topic, but the more that public space is broken down and is managed by different agents, all of them have different budgets. They will kind of look after their own. It's the tragedy of the commons, really, isn't it? You know, everyone looks after their own interests rather than the benefit of the place in the street as a whole, as a piece of a public good, in a sense.
We've got about 10 minutes left. We've got time. Our last poll was around the question of 7Ls. Tim, do you mind giving us a couple of minutes just explaining where this came from and how it might be useful for people when they're thinking about the movement networks that they're designing or looking at?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, those are Ls that I personally have used for many years now in design review when I'm a panel member, just to remember the points I might want to make, and also to focus. I mean, reasonably, the layout of the streets has come out with 25%, all of them at 50%. Thank you, because I think all of them are important. But that first point about location, and there's one missing there, which is linkage. So the way I think about it is the location is where you start. What's around the site? You know, where are the schools, the shops that people living here are going to want to get to? And therefore, what are the linkage points that you either or already exist or you might create? How do you then design the layout? Rather than start with designing the layout, that's the third point, third stage, design the layout, to seamlessly or simply connect from the linkage to the heart of the site and through. Then how do you dispose land uses across the site, which is missing from that list, because you know, where's the local community centre, not just the houses, where's the local shop? The landscape, what's the character, the quality of the different spaces? How might one part of the site be have a different character to another? And that's actually in the design guide. That's, you know, already well covered by the National Design Guide. And then lining, what's that? Well, that's how do the buildings meet the streets? Are they presenting a blank frontage at the ground level, or are they presenting an active frontage at the ground level? Again, implied in the design guide is just an L that helps me remember. And then, thanks, Garry, your last point about longevity. I can't take all the credit for this. How do you both design, I think, with high quality materials that are going to last, but also how do you understand that this place needs to be managed in the long run? It's not just going to happen of its own accord.
My system doesn't let me unmute my microphone unless I close the chat window, so I don't know what's going on. Thank you for that, Tim. Cheers. We are coming to the end now. Are there any the bits that I think we've covered so far, kind of the quality of the places we make, which is in the design guide. We've talked about integration and structure. We've talked a little bit about inclusivity and play, and maybe Juliet, I don't know if you want to say any more on that. There's a question in the Q&A that I think, let me read it quickly. Given the question is, it's from an anonymous attendee, which is fair enough. Given the inverse economics that those most impacted by poor mobility and outcomes are those whose voice is least heard and engaged in planning, how can we better share decision making to be proportional to the impact? I think that's a very difficult. It's the old problem of getting to the hard to reach groups, isn't it? Who, you know, by very definition.
It's interesting because it's sort of things you touched on already. So I think it's really good, for example, in Bristol, where the mayor is taking diesel traffic out of the city. And it's really interesting in Birmingham how the city is stopping cross movement in the city. And these moves, these strategic moves to take the burden of negative traffic movement out of inner urban areas, for example, are really good. But the next steps might be to answer the question that person's proposed, is about how do you give people more agency over their neighbourhood, over the place where they walk to school. And one way to start might be to start with schools and to start with projects of altering streets around schools, which has happened in Hackney in London, for example. And that could be one way to start. And the other way, perhaps to address that, is also Phil's idea about the idea of developers commuting community assets to communities so that they are able to actually take ownership of public spaces and define their use. So there's different things, aren't there? But those sort of mechanisms about making space for people to become incrementally more engaged.
There was a phrase that I heard a design review, and I'm trying to recall now who came up with. I thought it was really good. We talk about green infrastructure and blue infrastructure, but we can also talk about red infrastructure, which is the kind of human, the lifeblood of a place. So how can you set up community vehicles, organisations, stewardship, so that as people move into an area, they actually do have some kind of stake in that and have a say in what that place is, and building that community infrastructure. So I think it's just as important. And some developers do that, and I think more need to be encouraged to do that, particularly on larger sites. And where we talk about garden towns and villages and the principle of land value capture, how can some of that value, that uplift, be captured and given to these kind of fledgling community organisations to actually do have a stake in how they operate and look after their place. I think that's really, really important.
One of the areas I'm working on is the idea of a stewardship initiative, which is both about the long-term operations, management, inclusion of a community, but also how you can see that as a benefit from an investment perspective, that the best places make money over the long term. And there's an argument that it's not the planning system that's the problem, it's the business model behind the planning system that's the model. If you flip the business model from an overnight sale to actually a lifetime and multi-generational investment, then there's a lot more money to be made over a lot longer term for all involved.
Do we have a sufficient, do you think that one of the things that strikes me, and it's something that I think is coming out through the whole conversation, is a lot of these decisions about how, both in terms of how we physically structure places, but also then how we manage and kind of curate them into the future, seems to be made without good sight of data. Is there, for example, that long-term strategic planning, do people even know that that's out there? I mean, I don't know many house builders who are talking in those terms at all, actually.
I think the times are changing. I really do. I think the silver lining of the coronavirus has been that it's been a shot in the arm for alternative ways of working, and an encouragement to think differently. And these new and previously perhaps radical ideas will come to the fore. It's going to take time to work itself out. But I think the old estates, the old landowners have always known this. And so getting some of the house builders to understand this and engage. Why do we allow placemaking to be done by house builders? It's the wrong business model.
Yes, it is, because partly it is because they're always interested in disposing of those assets there and then, aren't they? And then they don't have any long-term interest, as you're saying. And there's projects that people have been always looking at, Poundbury and Harlow, which both had landowners with long-term interests in those estates. So yeah, so how to build in that longevity. It is interesting that lots of private developers and public sector leaders are looking at zero carbon and how they can deliver that, and all of this does feed into that as well. So perhaps there will be more imperative to act, hopefully.
And data and tools support this. Sorry, Phil. Just the fact, Juliet, you're using an open space syntax model, that's brilliant. And that's these tools. Younger planners, geographers are already using GIS. They're already using data and digital. It may be that it's the more senior and therefore more experienced and therefore older people in power who have a bit more of a difficulty with this. We are going to see a radical change in the appetite for digital in the next decade.
Also, in a previous webinar, Peter Neal spoke about design teams looking at demographics and using data to understand those correctly. And in North Bristol, when we looked at the area we were thinking about, we found that there were lots of young children, but they had a higher than average obesity level. So you can, those sort of things are just there for you to discover. So people should look at that. And I think also I found preparing for this webinar, I just looked a bit at national statistics and found that 2/5 of the population are either over 65 or under 16. So that's quite a big constituency that we should be thinking of when we design places. So it's those kind of things. Or 1 in 7 families are single parent families, and so that means they have lots of pressures on them about travel to work and children dropping children off and all those kinds of things. We know that, so there are ways to challenge our normative way of looking at places.
I'm conscious that we started 5 minutes late, so we're going to run over. There's another question here from Andy Kennard here that says, how would you encourage design professionals to be agents for change in the face of kind of traditional vehicle-led design values? I guess that's a question about culture. Does anyone want to comment on where we see the kind of design culture around who takes precedent in terms of thinking about transport needs?
Maybe I could pick that up, and actually I just note on the Q&A, so Andy asked the question, how would you encourage design professionals to be agents for change? So I think at the moment, you know, the reality is that it is the highway engineers, is the adopting authority who tend to have the final say, and the legislative framework allows them to do that, because if a highway authority chooses not to adopt a particular design of a street, or material choices, or suds or trees, then it's quite a powerful influence on the developer not to do a certain thing. So I think we do have to challenge that and think about how we do that. One of the ways that we might be able to do that is through design review. So design review, you know, I've been doing for quite some time now, and I think it's a very powerful process that brings in a group of people. I know we all do design review, have no stake in a proposal, apart from we would all like to see it being as good as it can be. And those design reviews have tended to focus on schemes coming through the planning system, and they focus on the buildings and perhaps the layout of development. I think there's an increasing a place, and I know that Design Midlands are pushing that, the design network is pushing that, to extend design review to street schemes. And so to broaden out, I think, you know, Juliet was saying things like, is this a good place for children to play? That would not be a question that would be normally asked. The questions would be, is it safe? Will it cause too many accidents? Will it have the capacity? What will the speeds be, and so on? But, you know, questions about usability by certain groups of the community would not be asked. And maybe design review might be able to ask that question and those questions, and to broaden out, if you like, the measures of success or the objectives of a street pattern, of street design. So it's early days. Obviously, questions are who would pay for such a thing, but I hope that it can be tested and the worth can be demonstrated, and we can show that you know, through some probing, some discussion, we will lead to better outcomes, better designs.
Thank you. We have got 2 minutes. Panel, any pressing points that you feel you need to make, or topics you think we've missed here?
Well, my ambition is to create standards for a lot of what we're talking about. You know, how do you know when you've got enough permeability? You can have too much permeability. How do you know when you've got enough? Have too much, everything dilutes. So what we're working on at Space Syntax are standards. And in the way that you can have acoustic standards, thermal insulation standards, why can't you also have urban standards of connectivity? So that's what I mentioned. On a completely different subject, I think having the words, getting the words right. So my advice to everyone listening is, whenever you hear someone say road, remind them it's a street. Just really simple. Think streets, not roads. And people go, why? Hold on. You know, roads are cars, streets are people, aren't they? And equally, don't talk about transport, talk about mobility. So that's the little experiment I'm running here locally, that I'm helping a local authority develop a transport strategy. And I've said, well, why don't we call it a mobility and public realm strategy? And everyone goes, what's that? Oh, of course. So after just that little bit of education, whether it's the architect, the planner, the transport engineer, whoever it is, now everyone talks about the mobility strategy. So that's my little takeaway.
Okay, go on, Juliet. Have you got any takeaways that you want to chuck in there quick?
I just one thing, which is just from Esther Curlin from Urban Design London. She was talking about good journeys and fewer journeys. So it was just a sort of a thing about the quality of our experience when we're traveling and when we're journeying, just to think about that. Because we often think about movement as the sort of functional thing between destinations, but it can be like a qualitative experience in itself. So, so it might be, that might be sort of designing for a 6-kilometre cycle ride when you're thinking of a place, as well as a walk to the shops. I
think as well, and the last thought for me is about fewer journeys, and the fact that we're having this communication via Zoom. I think there was an earlier one of these webinars where the question was asked about, will you commute? Yes, and I think work from home. It tends to be people who have perhaps desk-based jobs, but that's a big proportion of the workforce. And if we are making fewer journeys, and we make a fewer journeys in the peak hours, which is when the network is under stress, that has the potential, even if we take only 10% of the traffic away, that I know as a traffic engineer, it's the last 10% where all the delays come from. And for decades we've been designing our urban networks for the peak hour, for the worst couple of hours in the day, or 10 hours in the week. And these streets are massively over-designed. If we don't need to do that anymore, if we can just claw a bit back, there's a huge amount of space out there that we could apportion to walking and cycling and public transport. So I kind of hope that some of this will stick, and that reduction in unnecessary commuting is a massive opportunity going forward to reallocate some space within our towns and cities.
All right, thank you very much. I'm going to have to bring this meeting to a close. We're 7 minutes over. I know this is one of those things we could talk about all day. I've massively enjoyed it, so I want to say thank you everyone for thanks for your participation, panel. You've been fantastic, and thank you to everyone who came along. We do have, if you need to visit either the Creating Excellence or the Design Midlands website to see the next webinar details, and I encourage everybody who's attended today to sign up for that. These have been, I think, really interesting sessions, and we're lucky to have the kind of quality of panels that we have coming to these. So thank you all. Enjoy the rest of your day, and we will see you at the next event. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Gary. Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.